Welcome to a world where every curl was a lie, and behind the perfect part lurked a shameful layer of glue. We grew used to seeing them as gods of flawless beauty, but the truth may make your skin crawl. While women were losing their heads over them, these Hollywood idols were gluing someone else's hair onto their own heads every morning to conceal a gleaming bald spot. We are about to rip the fake scalps off those who spent decades feeding us counterfeit masculinity. Get ready to see the true, utterly naked face of the Golden Age, the one studios buried under tons of hairpieces. But before we move on to our first star, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, hit like, and leave a comment. Enjoy the show.
Humphrey Bogart. Humphrey Bogart went down in history as the embodiment of toughness, a man with a cigarette perpetually clenched between his teeth and a weary gaze that had seen it all. Few people knew, however, that beneath his iconic fedora lay a tragedy capable of ending the career of any macho leading man of the era. Around the age of 35, just as Bogey was stepping out of the shadows of secondary gangster roles into the spotlight of stardom, his hair began to thin at an alarming rate. The cause was not heredity alone, but a severe form of alopecia areata. Doctors of the time could only shrug. Relentless studio pressure, gallons of cheap whiskey, and endless clouds of cigarette smoke were quite literally burning out the actor's hair follicles. For Bogart, who never considered himself handsome to begin with, every new clump of hair left on his pillow felt like a death sentence. In 1940s Hollywood, a balding romantic hero was an absurdity, a professional liability the system would spit out without hesitation. Warner Brothers saw him as a gold mine, but that mine was beginning to glint suspiciously at the crown, and the executives made a decision. If nature was taking its due, they would simply buy it back. By the time Casablanca went into production, the issue had become impossible to ignore. The lighting equipment of the era was merciless. Powerful arc lamps created such glaring reflections on Bogart's thinning scalp that cinematographer Arthur Eidson reportedly clutched his head in horror. No comb-over could save him anymore. That was when Hollywood's invisible heroes stepped in, the hairpiece makers, the toupee craftsmen. Bogart was fitted with custom pieces made on the finest silk mesh, each hair woven in at a precise angle to mimic natural growth. A single piece could cost up to $500, a staggering sum at the time, enough to buy a used car. These hairpieces were so delicate and fragile that they lasted only a few days of shooting. Bogart loathed them, calling them dead rats in private, and considered the daily gluing ritual the most humiliating part of his job. The hair technician spent up to 2 hours every morning using a special alcohol-based adhesive, mastic, to weld the mesh firmly to the actor's skull. The real hell began once Bogart stepped onto the set. Under the blazing lights, the temperature inside the sound stages often climbed above 40 degrees Celsius. Humphrey, who sweated like any normal man, could feel a literal greenhouse forming beneath the hairpiece. The glue began to break down, mixing with sweat and makeup, causing unbearable itching and skin irritation. But Rick Blaine was not allowed even the smallest scratch. One careless movement could shift the piece, and the camera would capture the shameful seam where mesh met forehead. His leading ladies, including the radiant Ingrid Bergman, were let in on the secret and showed remarkable tact. In the famous farewell scene at the airport, when their faces are dangerously close, Bergman had to carefully control her movements to avoid brushing her fingers against the edge of his artificial scalp. During their embrace, Bogart was coiled tight with tension. Behind his hard mask lurked the terror that at the most romantic moment in cinema history, his hair might simply remain on Ingrid's shoulder. Offset, Bogart tried to be honest, but the magic of cinema dictated its rules even in private life. He was an avid sailor and loved spending time on his yacht, Santana. The sea, however, tolerates no deception. There is a legendary story, long whispered in Hollywood bars. One day, relaxing with friends and deep in his cups, Bogart decided to make a dramatic dive straight from the deck into the water. He forgot one small detail. He was fully dressed for show, wearing his finest hairpiece. When the actor resurfaced, his head shone in the sun like a billiard ball, while the toupee drifted a few meters away, resembling a dead jellyfish. A tomb-like silence fell. Without losing his composure, Bogart retrieved the hairpiece, slapped it back on upside down, and muttered, "I hope the fish weren't too frightened." From that day on, he never went out to sea without his trusty captain's cap, which he secured to his head almost more firmly than the hair itself. Humphrey Bogart died in 1957, taking countless secrets with him to the grave, but his baldness was the most carefully guarded of them all. Even on his deathbed, ravaged by illness, he avoided appearing without a hat in front of anyone outside his closest inner circle. The studio system had made a miracle. Millions of people still look at him and see thick hair, unaware that what they are seeing is the result of titanic craftsmanship by hairpiece makers and the personal courage of an actor who endured daily torture by glue to preserve the illusion. Bogart proved that cool has nothing to do with how much hair you have, and everything to do with carrying your lie so high that no one dares question it. He fooled us all, and we are grateful for the deception, because without his fake forelock, Casablanca would have been a very different film. It was a great sacrifice on the altar of cinema, to give up one's own face in order to remain forever in humanity's memory as the perfect hero, sealed with a flawlessly glued destiny.
Charles Boyer. If Humphrey Bogart treated his receding hairline as an annoying inconvenience, for Charles Boyer, the loss of his hair became an existential crisis. This refined Frenchman, with his velvet gaze and an accent that made women weak at the knees, began going bald at alarming speed barely into his 20s. For an actor whose entire screen persona was built on romantic seduction, it felt like a form of physical castration. Boyer understood the brutal truth of 1930s Hollywood. A bald lover was a comic figure, not the man whispered to in the half-light. He became a prisoner of his own image before his name ever appeared in large type on marquees. Each morning began with a panicked inspection of his pillow, and when the territory of retreat became impossible to ignore, Charles accepted the rules of a game that turned his life into an endless masquerade. He became one of the first actors to elevate the wearing of a wig into a covert state operation, whose scale astonished even the most hardened studio executives. Boyer did not simply wear a wig, he possessed an entire library of hairpieces, each with its own inventory number and specific purpose. There were wigs for waking up, slightly disheveled with a carefully crafted illusion of natural morning disorder, daytime wigs, severe and impeccable, and ceremonial ones, lush creations reserved for public appearances. Most astonishing of all was the way he simulated aging. He owned special sets of hairpieces with varying degrees of gray and thinning, allowing audiences to believe the actor was changing naturally with time. His personal wig maker was the highest paid employee on his staff because he was not creating hairstyles, but the illusion of a life lived. These pieces were made from natural hair purchased from European monasteries and mounted on an ultra-thin gauze base that became invisible when it touched the skin. The price of this beauty, however, was steep. Boyer lived in constant terror that someone might glimpse his real head, which in moments of despair he himself referred to as a dead landscape. Fear of exposure drove Boyer to a level of paranoia that found its way into his contracts. His agreements with Paramount and MGM contained a special clause known as the right to angle. Cinematographers, under threat of dismissal, were forbidden to shoot Charles from above, the so-called high angle, lest the studio lights pierce the mesh and reveal the treacherous glue beneath. If a scene required the actor to bow his head, lighting crews constructed elaborate shadow patterns so that the crown of Boyer's head always remained safely in half-darkness. His colleagues on set learned the signs.
If Charles suddenly froze in an unnatural pose, it meant he had felt the edge of the mesh beginning to lift with sweat. At such moments, a technical pause for lighting was announced, and the actor vanished into his dressing room, where a master already waited with a vial of ether and fresh adhesive. His life became a dance across a minefield, where a mine could be any gust of wind or an actress's overly passionate embrace. Boyer's private life was no less tense than his work on set. Even at home he remained in character, preferring elegant berets or soft house caps whenever he was not wearing a wig. Guests never appeared at his mansion unannounced. The actor required at least 20 minutes to put his head in order. His most terrifying enemy was the wind. There are accounts from location shoots where Boyer refused to step out of his limousine until assistants erected a barrier of screens to shield his hair from the slightest breeze. Once, at a garden reception, a sudden gust lifted the edge of his wig in full view of a group of producers. Displaying remarkable self-control, Boyer simply pressed a hand to his head, feigning a sudden migraine, and did not remove it until he managed to slip away to the restroom. This unrelenting stress made him withdrawn and taciturn, a trait the public mistook for mysterious French melancholy, when in reality it was nothing more than the fear of being unmasked. Charles Boyer passed away in 1978, just 2 days after the death of his beloved wife. Only then did the world glimpse the true face of a man who had deceived the camera for decades. In his later years, he had almost stopped acting, unable to endure the torment of makeup routines and the constant dread of humiliation. His story is the story of how Hollywood can consume a person's identity, forcing them to feel shame toward their own body. Boyer was a great actor whose talent often remained in the shadow of his own wig. He proved that one could be the most desired man on the planet with a completely bald head, yet he never managed to forgive himself for this supposed flaw. He is remembered as the great lover, a man whose hair was as carefully constructed as the cardboard walls of studio castles, confirming a bitter truth. In the world of dreams, even truth must be glued down tight.
Fred Astaire was a man whose elegance became proverbial, yet behind every effortless glide across the dance floor hid a ruthless insecurity about his own appearance. From the very start of his career, Fred considered his face unfortunate, a nose too long, ears too large, and worst of all, a hairline that began its treacherous retreat back when he was still performing on Broadway with his sister Adele. In the mirror, Astaire called himself a frightened rabbit and lived in constant terror that baldness would turn him into a figure of ridicule, shattering the image of the refined cavalier in tails and top hat. By the time he made his triumphant arrival in Hollywood in the early 1930s, the crown of his head already resembled a scorched prairie. RKO understood perfectly well that to sell the Astaire-Rogers pairing as the very embodiment of romance, Fred needed his youth restored. Thus began the dancer's long romance with California's finest hairpiece makers, who created for him the illusion of thick hair, capable of surviving even the most acrobatic routines. The main challenge in working with Astaire was his extraordinary mobility. Unlike Bogart, who could simply stand still in frame, Fred was in constant, sometimes ferocious motion. Spins, jumps, tap sequences where the head swung like a pendulum. Ordinary wigs of the time would have flown off at the very first pirouette. For Astaire, a unique attachment system was developed. The finest silk mesh was not merely glued to the skin, but integrated into the remaining hair at the sides of his head. The craftsman hand-matched shades from deep chestnut to ashen tones to mimic the natural play of light in motion.
Every morning, Fred spent long hours in the makeup chair as layers of a special alcohol-based compound were applied, strong enough to hold the piece in place even under heavy sweating. Astaire was obsessive about detail. Before every take, he demanded that his hair be inspected with a magnifying glass, because a single lifting edge of mesh could destroy the magic of the dance, turning a god into a balding middle-aged man. Despite all these precautions, shooting in overheated sound stages became a physical ordeal. Beneath the hairpiece, the skin could not breathe, and during hours-long rehearsals, sweat literally streamed into his eyes, pooling under the mesh. This caused the adhesive to bubble and weaken. There are accounts from witnesses who recalled rare outbursts of rage from the usually restrained Astaire. After a 20th take, when the hairpiece began to slide, Fred might tear it off his head and hurl it at the set wall, cursing, "This damned rag." He felt humiliated by the need to wear another man's hair, but his fear of appearing unattractive was stronger. The irony was that Ginger Rogers, his inseparable partner, knew the secret and often helped him discreetly adjust the piece between takes, shielding the fragile ego of his screen lover from the smirks of lighting technicians and extras. Away from the glare of the spotlights, Fred Astaire became a master of disguise. He was rarely seen in public without a hat. He popularized sports caps and soft felt hats, wearing them with such casual ease that everyone assumed it was part of his relaxed personal style, when in fact it was a harsh necessity. Astaire avoided bright sunlight and swimming pools, and never removed his headwear in company unless he was certain the lighting was sufficiently dim. He cultivated an aura of untouchability, keeping people at a distance so no one could study the unnatural line of his forehead. Even close friends admitted they had seen the real Fred only a handful of times. That distance fed his legend of aristocratic refinement, though in truth it was merely a wall built to protect his greatest secret. Fred Astaire danced on screen into old age, and his hairpieces aged with him, growing ever more sophisticated and invisible. He cheated time and biology, forcing the world to remember him as eternally youthful and impeccably groomed. His contribution to cinema was immense, that when the truth about his baldness became public knowledge in later years, it disappointed no one. On the contrary, it added humanity to his image. We came to understand that behind every light step stood not only flawless footwork, but the immense psychological strain of a man who quite literally assembled himself, piece by piece, in front of the mirror each day. Fred Astaire proved that a true artist can make an audience believe anything, even that his hair obeyed the rhythm as perfectly as his feet. His life was a grand performance, and the hairpiece was merely another costume, worn so that we could go on believing in the fairy tale.
Gary Cooper was more than just an actor. He was the living embodiment of the American spirit. Silent, honest, and unshakably handsome. A hero whose face seemed carved from stone. Yet, by the mid-1940s, cracks began to appear in this monolith where no one expected them. His famous forelock, which had once escaped so strikingly from beneath a cowboy hat, started thinning at an alarming pace. For Cooper, whose career was built on the image of the real man, hair loss struck at the very foundation of his ego. In those days, baldness was associated either with comical old men or desk-bound bureaucrats, never with the lone gunman who faces a gang at high noon. Gary began to notice that makeup artists were spending more and more time trying to stretch what remained of his hair across the crown of his head, and he realized that the era of honest hairstyles was over. To remain Coop, the man women were willing to die for, he had to enter a secret alliance with hairpiece craftsmen, turning his head into a highly complex engineering project. Cooper's greatest problem was his height. Exceptionally tall, he was constantly exposed to cameras that, in cramped sound stages, were often positioned below the level of his head or directly opposite his forehead. This meant that any hairpiece had to be not just good, but flawless. Paramount hired the finest specialists who developed a system of age transitions for Gary. At the beginning of a film, his character might have a full, vigorous head of hair, and by the finale, if the story required it, the piece would be subtly replaced with a more tired version. These wigs were constructed on bases so thin that a single careless movement by a makeup artist could tear a mesh worth hundreds of dollars. Cooper, a simple and straightforward man in real life, despised the fuss around his skull. He felt like a fraud when assistants rushed up to him between takes with tiny brushes to re-glue a lifting edge of hair at his temple. Yet he understood that without this adhesive, his career would collapse overnight. To reduce the need for full wigs, Cooper's costume designers resorted to a trick that later became a Hollywood standard. His iconic Stetsons and fedoras were fitted with special inserts that raised the hat slightly higher than normal, creating the illusion of thick hair concealed beneath. In scenes where Gary had to bare his head, lighting crews used backlighting that formed a halo around his silhouette, blurring the hard edges of the hairpiece. The most difficult challenge, however, was maintaining naturalness in intimate scenes. When Cooper leaned toward a partner for a kiss, he always did so at a precise angle, ensuring the light never struck the crown of his head directly. This required not only acting skill, but mathematical precision of movement. His leading ladies often complained about his stiffness in such moments, never suspecting that Cooper was simply afraid his manhood might come unglued in the middle of a romantic prelude. Outside the studio, Cooper remained an avid hunter and adventurer, which created additional complications for his secret hairstyle. He could not allow himself to appear before his hunting companions in a hairpiece, yet appearing bald was equally unthinkable. In the end, Gary developed the habit of never, under any circumstances, removing his headwear outdoors. There is a story from a mountain hunt where a powerful gust of wind tore off his hat along with a poorly secured hairpiece. Cooper, with the reflexes of a marksman, caught the entire contraption mid-air with one hand and instantly pressed it back to his head, continuing a discussion about ammunition calibers as if nothing had happened. His composure was boundless. He preferred to look like an eccentric man who slept in his hat, rather than admit that his legendary image was held together by sheer willpower and quality mastic. Toward the end of his life, when Cooper appeared in his final westerns, his wigs began to resemble genuine works of art, gray, thinning, and utterly natural. He simulated the aging of his artificial hair so convincingly that the public never suspected a thing. When the actor died in 1961, the world mourned the last great hero who departed with dignity. Cooper took the secret of his baldness to the grave, leaving us the image of a flawless man. His story is a reminder that Hollywood is above all a discipline. He sacrificed comfort and truth so that we could continue to believe in ideals. Gary Cooper proved that it doesn't matter what lies beneath your hat, thick locks or bare skin, as long as you stand straight and keep your gaze steady. His wig was merely part of his armor, worn in battle for our faith in cinema, and in that battle he emerged an absolute victor.
Bing Crosby. $1 million voice and a pennyworth crown. How America's favorite singer became a slave to a hairpiece. Bing Crosby embodied comfort and domestic calm. His voice was called the most pleasant sound in the world. Yet every day, standing in front of the mirror, Bing felt anything but pleasant emotions. Unlike many of his peers, Crosby was not consumed by vanity, but he was a hostage to the system. By the early 1940s, when his fame reached stratospheric heights, his own hair decided it wanted nothing more to do with stardom. Bing began to go bald in the classic grandfatherly way, starting at the crown, which soon shone like a freshly polished copper basin. Paramount Pictures, which had enormous plans for Crosby, delivered an ultimatum. A great voice was fine, but a bald Bing would not sell as many tickets as a Bing with a full head of hair. Thus began the singer's long war with an object he genuinely despised and referred to only as that damned scalp. For Crosby, a wig was not a tool of beauty, it was a work instrument, as tiresome as an ill-fitting suit or a faulty microphone. Crosby had a peculiar gift. He was lazy about vanity. Instead of spending hours in the makeup chair like Fred Astaire, he tried to introduce what he called a hat policy. In most of his films and public appearances, he insisted on headwear, caps, berets, fedoras, Panama hats. This spared him the daily ordeal of gluing on a hairpiece. Directors, however, were relentless. In romantic scenes or interior settings, the leading man had to bare his head. At such moments, Bing became the grumpiest man on set. His wigs were not as sophisticated as Boyer's and looked rather ordinary, which created its own problems. All too often, they resembled a piece of carpet slapped onto his head. Bing loathed the smell of mastic and the tight pulling sensation it left on his scalp. It sometimes bordered on farce. The moment the director shouted, "Cut," Crosby would tear the scalp off first thing, occasionally doing it right in front of the camera, unconcerned by the shock it caused among extras or sluchai visitors to the studio. Hollywood lore preserves an almost anecdotal incident that took place during the shooting of one of his musicals. Crosby was in a particularly foul mood that day and flatly refused to put on that stinking rag. Filming ground to a halt, losses mounting by the minute. In the end, the producers took an unprecedented step. They allowed Bing to act in the scenes without a hairpiece, but hired an entire department of artists. For months, these people sat in dark editing rooms, painstakingly painting hair onto the film negative, frame by frame, directly over Crosby's bald spot. It cost the studio a fortune, but Bing was happy. He sang his ballads, feeling the pleasant coolness on his crown. The incident became legendary, proof that Crosby's status was so great the studio was willing to grow hair on film itself rather than anger its primary breadwinner. Off-camera, Bing Crosby was almost the only star of his magnitude who feared his baldness. Friends and family were accustomed to seeing him without a wig. On the golf course, his greatest passion, he always wore a cap, but if it blew off, he would simply laugh and put it back on, never trying to shield his bare head with his hands. For the general public, however, the illusion had to be preserved. On the covers of his records, which sold in the millions, retouchers worked miracles, giving him a hairline any young man might envy. Bing often joked about the discrepancy. "People buy my records from my voice, not my hairstyle. If they could hear how my head sweats under that wig, they'd pity me, not envy me." His bluntness was a breath of fresh air in the stifling atmosphere of Hollywood lies, but even he could not fully defeat the tyranny of the screen image. Bing Crosby passed away in 1977, collapsing on a golf course right after a victorious round, exactly as he would have wanted, in his favorite cap and out in the open air. His wigs were left to gather dust in studio archives, silent witnesses to an era when image was everything. Crosby proved something remarkable. You can be an icon while sincerely despising the attributes of that very icon. He wore his fake hair like an annoying uniform, never allowing it to become part of his identity. We remember him not for his hairstyle, but for the warmth that flowed from his songs, and that was his greatest victory over Hollywood. He deceived us because it was his job, but in his heart he always remained the same man who dreamed of only one thing, that a strong wind would rise and carry all the wigs of the world far beyond the horizon, never to return.
John Wayne. John Wayne, or simply the Duke, was more than an actor to America. He was the bedrock on which the mythology of the Western stood. But by the 1940s, that rock began to gleam suspiciously at its very peak. Wayne started losing his hair in the classic male pattern. His forehead crept higher and higher, while a clearing opened at the crown that no clever comb-over could disguise.
For studio executives, this was a disaster. In their imagination, a cowboy leading the cavalry into battle could not have a bald spot. A hero was supposed to possess a thick mane that whipped dramatically in the wind as he galloped across the prairie. And so, John Wayne, a man who despised falseness of any kind, found himself bound in invisible chains forged by Hollywood wigmakers. He was required to wear hairpieces not only on screen, but at all public appearances as well. For Wayne, who valued blunt honesty above all else, this became a daily trial, turning every morning into a punishing ritual of gluing foreign scalps onto his head. Wayne did not rely on a single piece. He owned an entire collection of hairpieces, which he dryly referred to as his hats. Each one was a masterpiece, crafted from the finest natural hair, woven into ultra-thin mesh designed to withstand dust, heat, and sweat during grueling location shoots. The Duke had wigs for different stages of the action. One clean and neatly styled for saloon scenes, another slightly disheveled and dusted for desert chases. The greatest challenge was ensuring that the hair never looked alien against his rugged, weather-beaten face. His personal makeup artists became his closest confidants, the only people who ever saw the Duke in his true, vulnerable state. Wayne treated these accessories with grim humor, but behind the closed doors of the makeup trailer, he often growled that he would rather fight 100 Comanches than endure the alcohol-based glue that literally burned into his skin under the Arizona sun. Unlike many of his colleagues who lived in mortal fear of exposure, John Wayne possessed nerves of steel and a peculiar sense of honesty. An incident at Harvard in 1974 became legendary. When a student brazenly asked whether he was wearing a wig, Wayne didn't hesitate. He replied calmly, "It's not a wig, it's real hair. It's just not mine." The line instantly disarmed his critics. Wayne knew that everyone in Hollywood was aware of his secret, and he preferred to acknowledge it with his head held high rather than play hide-and-seek like Charles Boyer. That did not mean he allowed himself to relax on set. During the filming of They Were Expendable in 1945, director John Ford had to constantly ensure that sea spray during naval scenes did not loosen the edges of Wayne's hairpiece. The Duke could perform heroism, but he always remembered that his reputation as the ultimate macho man rested on a few drops of high-quality mastic. The Western is a genre where wind and dust are full-fledged characters, and for a balding actor, this meant constant danger. Wayne developed a special way of wearing his hat, pulling it down so tightly that the brim dug into his forehead, creating an additional barrier for the hairpiece. In fight scenes, assistants used invisible pins and extra layers of adhesive to keep the wig from flying off with the hat. Even so, mishaps occurred. During a shoot in Utah, a powerful gust of wind tore everything away at once. The extras froze, expecting an outburst of rage, but Wayne simply picked up his scalp, shook the sand from it, and shouted to the makeup man, "Hey, bring the glue, my fence just blew down." This simplicity and lack of false shame earned him even greater respect among the tough men of the crew. He wore his wig like part of his uniform, like a revolver or spurs. It was necessary for the job, and he handled it professionally. Toward the end of John Wayne's life, he stopped hiding his baldness away from work. On his yacht or among family, he went bareheaded, savoring his freedom from Hollywood standards. But for millions of viewers, he remained forever the man with the thick head of hair riding off into the sunset. His wigs aged alongside him, acquiring noble gray and thinning naturally, mirroring the passage of time. When Wayne died in 1979, his image remained unbroken. He proved that true masculinity is not what grows on your head, but how you carry your legend. John Wayne deceived us, but he did it so openly and honestly that the deception became part of his immense charm. He was the last of the Mohicans who understood that in Hollywood you can lose your hair, but you must never lose face, even if that face has to be carefully assembled every morning under the watchful eyes of makeup artists. Frank Sinatra. Frank Sinatra was a man for whom image meant everything. He was the gold standard of style, the king of cool, the leader of the Rat Pack, a man whose suits were pressed to razor sharpness and whose manners were immaculate. Yet behind this mask of supreme confidence hid a deep, almost pathological insecurity. Sinatra began to lose his hair rapidly in the late 1940s, at the very peak of his early fame. For a man whose appeal was built on romance and raw sexual magnetism, baldness felt like the collapse of an empire. Sinatra did not simply wear hairpieces, he turned them into a high-tech operation, sealed off from the public behind 7 locks. He hired the finest craftsmen in the world to create toupees on ultra-thin silk mesh designed to mimic the very pores of the skin. Frank was obsessed with secrecy. He forced staff to sign ironclad non-disclosure agreements, and any mention of his thinning crown in the press sent him into volcanic rage. Sinatra owned not 2 or 3 hairpieces, but an entire fleet of them, all traveling with him in a special armored case. His personal hairstylist was never more than 10 meters away, ready to intervene at a moment's notice. Frank's collection included options for different times of day and lighting conditions. There were slightly tousled versions for accidental paparazzi shots and dense, perfectly sculpted pieces for Las Vegas performances under the merciless glare of spotlights. He paid enormous sums for this illusion, yet even the finest materials could not spare him physical discomfort. Beneath the mesh, his scalp constantly itched, while the alcohol-based adhesive used to secure the edges caused chemical burns. Sinatra endured this daily torture without complaint, convinced that his status as an icon justified any pain. He was a prisoner of his own legend, a man who could not afford to be just a bald man, even alone in a hotel room. In Hollywood, everyone knew Sinatra's secret, but only the suicidally brave dared speak of it out loud. Members of the Rat Pack, Dean Martin, Sammy Davis Jr., Peter Lawford, joked about everything: his temper, his mob connections, his stormy love affairs, but his hair was forbidden territory. There is a story that at a party, a drunken guest once tried to clap Frank playfully on the head. An icy silence fell so complete you could hear the ice melting in the glasses. Sinatra fixed the man with his infamous killer stare, and moments later the unfortunate soul was escorted out by bodyguards. Frank built a true omerta around his scalp, a law of silence. He understood that his authority rested on the image of an untouchable leader, and baldness would have made him vulnerable, grounded, ordinary. The irony was that his closest friends all knew the truth and protected his ego, fully aware of how fragile it became when it came to his scalp. On set and on stage, Sinatra faced the same problems as his peers, but he dealt with them in his own ruthless way. In overheated studios, when sweat began to eat away at the glue, Frank demanded additional air conditioners aimed directly at him, even if the rest of the crew froze. If a cinematographer set the lights in a way that revealed the telltale sheen of mesh on his crown, Sinatra could simply turn around and walk off the set, shutting down production for the day. He insisted on specific camera angles, avoiding overhead shots that might expose his architectural secret. At his concerts in Caesar's Palace, makeup artists used mountains of powder and special sprays to blur the transition between skin and hairpiece. Sinatra lived in a state of permanent combat readiness, fighting nature itself to preserve the illusion he sold to the world, along with his immortal songs. Toward the end of his life, Frank grew even more cautious. In his later years, when baldness had become nearly complete, he appeared in public more and more often wearing his signature fedoras, which became part of his legend. Yet beneath every hat, the wig remained. Sinatra never surrendered.
When he died in 1998, the world mourned an era. He took his secret to the grave, though by then it was an open secret to everyone who mattered. Sinatra proved that charisma and talent can make people believe in a perfect image even when they know it is stitched together from silk mesh and borrowed hair. He was one of the great illusionists of his time, a man who made us look into his blue eyes and never lift our gaze just a little higher to where the truth lay hidden beyond his hairline. His hairpiece was part of his armor, his power, and his solitude, reminding us that even the most powerful men on earth carry their fears with them, carefully glued in place.
Gene Kelly. Gene Kelly burst into Hollywood as the antithesis of the refined Fred Astaire. He was muscular, explosive, grounded, the embodiment of a working-class guy who could dance. But there was one detail this athlete of choreography hid with the fury of a wounded animal. Kelly began losing his hair in his early 30s, and by the time he filmed his greatest masterpieces, the top of his head was a depressing sight. For Gene, whose appeal rested on youthful bravado and a thick mass of curls, baldness felt like a personal insult from nature itself. He didn't merely feel embarrassed by his thinning crown, he hated it. Unlike John Wayne, who could openly acknowledge his hat, Kelly demanded the impossible from his makeup artists. His hairpiece had to look as though it had just grown from his own scalp, while also surviving the insane physical punishment he subjected himself to in every frame. Thus began the era of the most complex and agonizing hair work in the history of the movie musical. The most iconic moment in world cinema, Kelly dancing with an umbrella in a downpour, was, for the actor, a technological nightmare. While audiences marveled at his smile and his splashes through puddles, Gene was waging a private war against the laws of physics. Water was his greatest enemy. Once soaked, the hairpiece became 3 times heavier, and even the strongest adhesive turned into slick sludge. To keep the wig from floating into a storm drain mid-take, MGM's hair specialists used a secret compound based on industrial rubber, which quite literally welded the mesh to Gene's skin. After filming the number, his scalp required weeks of recovery as the glue was torn away along with the top layer of epidermis. Kelly endured this torture with a smile aimed straight at the camera, knowing that every tilt of his head beneath the torrents of water could end in catastrophic exposure and the collapse of a shooting schedule worth millions of dollars. Gene Kelly was notorious for his difficult temperament and his obsessive attention to detail. If he spotted even the faintest hint that the transition between his real hair at the temples and the hairpiece was visible, the set froze in fear. He could torment lighting crews for hours, forcing them to reposition lamps so that no beam struck the crown of his head directly. His partners, including Debbie Reynolds, later recalled that Gene was extremely cautious in scenes involving physical contact. He designed choreography so that during lifts or embraces, a woman's hand would never rise above the back of his head. It was a ruthless game of belief and doubt, with his reputation as a sex symbol at stake. Gene preferred to be seen as a harsh, demanding tyrant rather than allow anyone to suspect that his legendary sweep of hair was nothing more than the masterful work of wig makers, held in place by sheer faith and toxic chemistry. Outside the studio, Kelly was almost never seen without his signature cap or beret. He turned them into part of his image as an approachable, ordinary guy, though in reality they were his only defense against curious eyes. Unlike Sean Connory, who would later make peace with hair loss, Kelly fought to the very end. Even in his later work, he insisted on dense, almost youthful hairpieces, which sometimes looked odd on the face of an aging man. He did not want to age gracefully, he wanted to remain the guy in the puddle. His pride would not admit defeat to time. At home, among family, he did remove his armor, but access to this inner sanctum was denied to anyone outside his closest circle. Gene Kelly created a forbidden zone around his head, guarded with the same ferocity he applied to perfecting his dance steps.
When Gene Kelly passed away in 1996, the world remembered him as the man who gave us joy and lightness. His wigs remained in studio archives as monuments to an era of total image control. Kelly proved that great art demands great sacrifices, even when those sacrifices are your own skin and a daily lie told to the mirror. He deceived us so gracefully and athletically that we gladly surrendered to the illusion. When we watch his leaps and spins, we see not a balding middle-aged man, but an eternal youth whose energy can stop the rain itself. His hairpiece was his mask, his shield, and his curse. Yet it was precisely this mask that allowed him to become an immortal symbol of the Golden Age, where even gravity and baldness bowed before the will of a great artist.
Jack Benny. Jack Benny was the king of American radio and television, a master of the pause and of self-mockery, a man who made millions laugh at his fictional stinginess and hopeless violin playing. Yet there was one subject in his life that inspired not laughter, but cold sweat and bouts of melancholy. Jack began losing his hair at the very moment his career took off, and for him it became a personal catastrophe. Unlike his on-screen persona, who would haggle over every last cent, the real Benny spent staggering sums on the finest wigs Hollywood could offer. He did not merely want to hide his baldness, he wanted to erase the very fact that it existed. By the early 1950s, his crown had turned into what insiders cruelly called a shining knee, but the public saw only a perfectly groomed, dense sweep of hair. Jack built an aura of inviolability around his head, turning the wearing of a toupee into a sacred ritual, the violation of which was punished by immediate exile from his inner circle. Thus, the funniest man in America became the captive of the least funny accessory in the world. What made Benny's case unique was his pathological fear of change. While other actors ordered hairpieces that aged along with them, Jack chose a single style and a single color and clung to them until the very end. His wigs were the pinnacle of hairpiece craftsmanship. Every strand was woven into an ultra-thin base to create the illusion of a natural part. Over time, however, this perfection began to work against him. When Jack was well into his 70s, his hair remained just as suspiciously thick and dark as it had been on the day of his triumph in To Be or Not to Be. The effect was strange, almost surreal. The comedian's face grew lined with wrinkles, yet his hair seemed frozen in time. Colleagues backstage whispered that Jack would sooner confess a love of spending money than allow a makeup artist to add even a single gray strand to his toupee. His wig became his armor against aging, an artificial shield he raised before the world, hoping no one would notice the trick. At NBC, where Jack filmed his shows, strict rules were in place. No one except his personal makeup artist was allowed into the room while Jack was putting on his face. He arrived at the studio with his hat pulled low, vanished behind a door, and emerged fully formed, already in character. Stories survive of assistants who accidentally burst into his dressing room without knocking. In those moments, Benny flew into a rage, clutching a towel to his head as if he had been caught in an indecent act. This secrecy bordered on the absurd. Jack refused to shoot scenes where water might fall on him, or where a powerful fan could threaten the stability of his hairpiece. The great comedian, who built his humor on vulnerability, was immovable as a rock when it came to the hygiene of his scalp. He lived in terror that if the audience ever saw his real bald spot, the magic would shatter, and they would see not an eternally youthful miser, but simply an old balding man. Benny's private life was steeped in the same deception. His wife, Mary Livingston, was his accomplice in maintaining the illusion of naturalness before guests. Their Beverly Hills home was always bathed in soft, dim light, leaving no chance to study the seams of the wig. Jack grew so fused to his second scalp that, according to rumor, he even slept in a special net to protect the styling when staying overnight away from home. His miserliness existed only on screen. In reality, he was a generous man who spared no expense when it came to preserving his hair legend.
The tragedy was that this obsession robbed him of the chance to age with dignity as others later would. Benny clung to another man's hair until his final breath, convinced that his talent was inseparable from his appearance. When Jack Benny died in 1974, the world mourned a great entertainer who had taught America to laugh at itself. Even in his coffin, he lay wearing his immaculate wig. He did not allow death itself to expose what he had hidden so carefully for 40 years. His story is a reminder of how cruel the entertainment industry can be to those who fear losing youthful appeal. Jack Benny deceived us, but the deception was his way of surviving in a world that does not forgive weakness. He remains in our memory as a man with sad eyes and an eternal sweep of hair, proof that in Hollywood one can be a master of truth in art while remaining a great liar when it comes to one's own reflection in the mirror. His wig left the world with him, the final secret of a man who gave everything to laughter, yet never managed to laugh at his own bare head.
Sean Connery. Sean Connery became the global standard of masculine sexuality the moment he slipped into a flawless tuxedo in Dr. No, 1962. His James Bond was vain, dangerous, and crowned with a magnificent, thick head of hair. And therein lay the greatest secret of British intelligence. Sean Connery had begun losing his hair rapidly at the age of 21 during his service in the Royal Navy. By the time filming on the Bond series began, the 30-year-old actor was already almost bald at the crown. Producers Albert Broccoli and Harry Saltzman were horrified. In their vision, a super spy who seduced the most beautiful women in the world simply could not have a bald spot. Connery was given a blunt choice: want the role, wear the wig. And so the great Scot became a captive of the toupee, which accompanied him throughout all the classic Bond films, creating the illusion of a perfect hero while bare truth hid beneath the mesh. Filming the Bond movies demanded enormous physical endurance. Connery leapt from trains, fought in cramped compartments, and endured long, highly charged erotic scenes. Every morning began with wig makers quite literally welding the hairpiece to Sean's scalp. The greatest nightmare came during shoots in exotic, humid locations. On Goldfinger and Thunderball, sweat constantly ate away at the adhesive, forcing makeup artists to rush into frame every 15 minutes to re-glue the lifting temples of Agent 007. Connery himself treated all this with undisguised irritation. He was a large, rugged man and felt ridiculous surrounded by people fussing over him with combs and jars of glue. It is said that during bed scenes with his leading ladies, Sean displayed iron discipline, moving with such precision that no careless gesture could dislodge his legendary hairstyle and shatter the spell of the moment. Unlike some of his predecessors on our list, Gary Cooper or Charles Boyer, for instance, Sean Connery did not suffer from a painful complex about his appearance. Offset, he took enormous pleasure in removing the hair and walking around completely bald, to the shock of paparazzi and admirers alike. Connery despised pretense and regarded the wig as nothing more than part of his work costume, like a Walther PPK or a Rolex watch. His honesty terrified studio executives. They feared that if the public saw a bald Bond on vacation, box office receipts would collapse. But Sean was immovable. He became the first actor of his stature to openly display his bald head in real life, proving that male charisma has nothing to do with the amount of hair on one's head. This quiet rebellion ultimately helped him step out of Bond's shadow and become a truly great dramatic actor. When Connery finally parted ways with Bond, setting aside his later return in Never Say Never Again, he made a historic decision: no more wigs. In his later Oscar-winning roles, such as The Untouchables and The Name of the Rose, he appeared before the world exactly as he was. And something extraordinary happened. The world fell in love with him even more. His bald head, paired with a gray beard, became a symbol of wisdom, stature, and undiminished masculinity.
Connory staged a quiet revolution in Hollywood, showing that aging openly is not a sentence but a privilege. He was the only man on our list who managed to tear off the mask and the wig without losing his status as a sex symbol, and in fact strengthening it. His example cleared the path for many modern actors who no longer fear their own nature. Sean Connery passed away in 2020 at the age of 90, remembered as a man who outplayed the system itself. His story is the perfect finale to our parade of baldness. He began as a hostage to Hollywood standards, forced to endure daily glue-bound torture for the sake of Agent 007, and ended as a free man whose honest bald head became his most recognizable trademark. Connery proved that any lie, no matter how expensive or beautiful, fades before the power of an authentic personality. We remember his Bond in a wig, but we love Sean himself, unadorned and unmasked. He closed the door on an era of total deception, showing that a true star shines on its own and needs no borrowed hair glued in place with mastic.
We have taken a walk through the most shameful backstage corridors of Hollywood's golden age, where behind dazzling smiles and flawless hairstyles stood ordinary balding men, trembling every day over each fallen hair. This story teaches us that Hollywood was not a dream factory, but a factory of total industrial-scale deception, where even the gods were slaves to cosmetic glue. 10 legends worshipped by millions of women and imitated by millions of men turned out to be prisoners of scraps of someone else's hair and toxic mastic. We saw Humphrey Bogart and Gary Cooper gambling their masculinity on the quality of a toupee, Frank Sinatra turning his baldness into a state secret worthy of the mafia, and Gene Kelly risking public humiliation under streams of water at the most iconic moment of his career. Only Sean Connery found the strength to hurl that fake scalp in the faces of studio bosses, proving that true charisma needs no crutches. The golden age of Hollywood shone brightly, but now we know the truth. That glow came not from the actors' sanctity, but from their polished, bald heads, which an army of makeup artists frantically concealed beneath layers of expensive hairpieces. The illusion is shattered forever, and the next time you turn on a classic masterpiece, you will no longer watch the performance, but the actor's hairline, wondering whether it will start to slip in the next shot under the heat of the lights. It was a great sacrifice on the altar of cinema, trading one's true face for a glued-on destiny, and today we have finally closed this shameful chapter of history, leaving Hollywood's idols alone with their shining nakedness.